We've already considered the other Upanishads, and we now arrive at discussing or catching up with the rest that we haven't spoken about. And that would entail talking about Mandukya, Taittiriya, Chandogya, Bradaranyaka, Aitareya, Svetasvatara, and Maitri Upanishads. I'd say already almost immediately that I'm sure to have murdered the names and their pronunciations, but they're here written in front of you so that you can actually uh, see also the names. Let's begin with the Mandukya Upanishads. The Upanishad is named after the sage Mandukya, who taught about the four states of consciousness, namely the waking state, dreaming state, deep sleep state, and a fourth state which he identifies simply as Turiya. These states are explained using the syllable Om, the sacred syllable. The Upanishad, this Upanishad is the shortest, consisting only of 12 verses, and it became famous because Gaudapada wrote a commentary on it in the 6th century Common Era. Gaudapada was the teacher of Govindapada, who in turn taught the famous Shankaracharya or Shankara. Shankara, since that's the easiest word to pronounce, is associated with Advaita or the philosophy of non-dualism, which will eventually become one of the dominant themes of the Upanishads. Let's look at the opening verses. Om, the syllable is all these. All that is past, present, and future is also Om. And whatever is beyond this threefold time, that too is Om. All these is verily Brahman. The self within is Brahman. It has four states. The first is the waking state, Jagrat, outwardly cognitive. It has 7 limbs, 19 mouths, and experiencing the gross material objects. Remember, there are 4 states, and now we're looking at the waking state. What are the 7 states that are being discussed here and the 19 mouths? The 7 limbs do not pertain to the human body here, but to the cosmic body, Vaisvanara. They are enumerated in the Chandoga, which we will discuss later in this lecture, but nevertheless, the verse from Chandogya says it this way. The heavens are his head, the sun his eyes, the air his breath, the fire his heart, the water his stomach, the earth his feet, and space his body. So that's 7. Head, eyes, breath, heart, stomach, feet, and body. These are the 7 limbs being referred here, whereas the 19 mouths that is being referred also in the earlier passage are the 5 sense organs, the 5 organs of action, and the 5 organs of actions refer to walking, talking, expelling, procreating, and handling. The 5 pranas, that makes it 15 now, the mind, the intellect, and the ego sense and thought. No? So that's the addition to the 5 organs, 5 sense, pranas, mind, intellect, ego, sense, and thought. Ego, sense, and thought. No? So 5 pranas, the mind, the intellect, and then the ego, sense, and thought. So the Upanishad continues. The second is the dream state. No? So we're done with the waking state. Now we move to the dream state, which they call Svapna, inwardly cognitive, also having 7 limbs and 19 mouths. In this state, one experiences the subtle impressions of the mind. The third state is the deep sleep or dreamless sleep, prajna. As the darkness of night covers the day and the invisible world seems to disappear, so also in the dreamless sleep, the veil of unconsciousness envelops the thought and knowledge, and the subtle impressions of the mind apparently vanish. It is a mass of cognition. It is blissful. Its phase is thought. In this state, the person is said to be blissful since neither anxiety or strife are experienced. Prajna rules over all, knows all things, and is the inner controller. It is the origin and the goal of all. The fourth is actually Turiya. While we're familiar with the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state, we're not very familiar with the Turiya. But it's explained this way. Turiya is not inwardly cognitive nor outwardly cognitive, not both wise cognitive. It is not a cognition mass, not cognitive, not non-cognitive, unseen, incapable of being spoken of, ungraspable, without any distinctive marks, unthinkable, unnameable, the essence of the knowledge of the one self, that into which the world is resolved, the peaceful, the benign, the non-dual, that is the Atman, that is to be realized. So while the Mandukya Upanishads started with the Om, it ends actually with a discussion of the Atman. Now, there are three states, and Turiya, here we see a world to indicate a state beyond deep sleep. The stages of waking and dream are actually bound by cause and effect. Prajna, or deep sleep, is cause alone. Turiya is beyond cause and effect. In a way, these look like a hierarchy of sorts, which we also need to pay attention to if we are to recognize the play between these four states. Gaudapada writes, Prajna, or the deep sleep state, does not know itself. It does not know anything else either. It does not know the real or the unreal. It does not know anything. Turiya, the fourth, knows everything and knows it always. What does it mean for something to know everything and knows it always is interesting. Nevertheless, it is worth emphasizing how there are degrees of knowing and not knowing that is present here. Let's look at Prajna and Turiya. In the Prajna state, we are totally unconscious. In the Turiya state, you are beyond consciousness and unconsciousness. Technically, you are super conscious. Prajna and Turiya have one thing in common. They neither have perception of the phenomenal world, neither do they experience the phenomenal world or the world of senses. Prajna is asleep because it suffers from ignorance, while Turiya, on the other hand, is free from ignorance. What is the meaning of Om in relation to this? So after having defined these three states and Turiya, the waking state, the dreaming state, the deep sleep state, and Turiya, the Upanishad continues. This is the Atman symbolized by Om, which has four parts. The akara, or the sound A, or the A sound of Om, represents the waking state and is the root of the words apti, meaning acquiring, obtaining. So whoever knows these obtains all desires and is the best of all. The ukara, or the U sound of the Om, represents the dream state and is the root of the word utkarsa, which means to lift up, exaltation. That's why it says, he who knows this excels in his power of understanding, in the continuity of knowledge, and becomes equal to that understanding. No one in his lineage is born ignorant of Brahman. The waking state includes the universe as we know it. If we understand the nature of this universe in its entirety, there is no desire we cannot fulfill. One who understands this universe totally becomes the best of all. And that is why for quite some time that's how we've understood philosophy, as a form of knowledge that of the world that allows us to become the best of all. The second part is deeper here. It involves the knowledge of the dream state. The realm of cause and effect is contained in the dream and waking states. Modern analyses, or modern psychoanalysis for that matter, is based on the premise that to understand human behavior in the waking state, one must understand the dream state, more precisely, the dream symbols. Carl Gustav Jung points to the collective unconscious and the archetypal symbols that exert a powerful influence on the individual, whether we are aware of this or not. Thus, to understand the waking state, we must also understand the dream state. And this is the meaning of continuity of knowledge. One who understands both becomes equal to that understanding. The lineage referred to means the succession of students who learn from such an individual. This lineage is aware of a deeper dimension of reality, since neither of these two states can express and explain the phenomenon of life completely. Being awake, or the waking state, and the dream state is not able to do so. That's why we need to look at prajna and turiya again. Prajna is the state of deep silence and is presented by the M sound of Om. It is derived from the root mi, meaning to measure or even to merge. Whoever knows this measures all these and merges all these into oneself. The fourth, Turiya, is represented by the silence after the Om, which has no elements. It cannot be spoken of, into which the world is resolved, benign, and non-dual. Thus, the syllable Om is the Atman, and whoever knows these realizes Brahman. So Gaudapada says that just as we realize upon waking that the dream images were simply our imagination, so we will realize that this world was simply our mental projection when we awake to the awareness of Brahman. We read, in a dark place, you see a rope, but you are not sure you are seeing a rope. You think you are seeing a snake, a jet of water, or some such thing. All these are illusions. There is nothing but a rope, and you have the illusion that the rope is a snake. Because of this illusion, fear comes and a host of other images. The snake has no existence independent of the rope. Similarly, this world has no existence independent of Brahman. The relationship between the world we see and Brahman is the same as the relationship between the snake and the rope. So whether we're seeing a snake or whether we are seeing a rope is something we need to pay attention to And that's something we arrived at by seeing the relationship between the waking state and also the sleeping state. Let's go to the Taittiriya Upanishad. This is often called the convocation address since it gives to departing students a list of ethical principles to follow for life. It is also famous for its description of 5 layers or koshas of the human being. These 5 koshas stands for food, breath, mind, intellect, and bliss. 5 layers, no, sorry, 5 koshas or layers. So the layers of the body, mind, and the higher mind. The physical body with bone and muscular tissue is obviously intertwined with the circulatory nervous systems or the pranamaya kosha. The pranamaya kosha is again intertwined with the mind. This has been demonstrated by medical science, especially in the context of psychosomatic diseases. At the everyday level, we see that mental stress and anxiety affects the functioning of the nervous system, and in turn, the physical system. Ideas then do affect our health. So we know that the skeletal system, the musculatory system, the circulatory system, and even the neural system are all related to each other, and therefore is something that affects one another. No? So let's look at the 5 koshas. The 5 koshas, as we said, stands for the physical body, the electric body, the mind, reason, and also bliss. Living from the level of reason is living from the level of pure reflective consciousness. Most of us subordinate reason by the mind, especially with reference to our emotions. We rationalize our decisions made from an emotional level, and that's how they are related. Let's look at the science of speech from this perspective. We will expound pronunciation, letters of or sounds, pitch, quality, quantity, force or stress, articulation, and combination. These are the principles of pronunciation. This world is one of combinations. Here are the great combinations. The earth is the prior form. The heaven is the latter form. The ether is their junction, and the air is their connection. Speech is the means of communication between the teacher and the taught. Thus, the pronunciation, the intonation, and emphasis of words, as well as their combinations, are extremely important to convey an accurate meaning. Language, therefore, is the science of combination of words, which are in turn combinations of sounds. Reflecting upon the miracle of language is a meditation on Brahman. Now, from language, we can look at the combinations of knowledge. Now, as to knowledge, the sage will continue. The teacher is the prior form. The student is the latter form. Knowledge is their junction, and instruction is the connection. In this verse, the sage conveys the cosmic dimension of learning with regard to instruction or even teaching. It's not an isolated event, but part of the cosmic process. All knowledge builds on past knowledge. We cannot know anything new without it coming from the old. It's like when you do research, you need to do RRL or related literature. It is an infinite chain. We are all part of the knowledge chain. This will be later echoed by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras as the principle of Isvara. If I have been able to see this far, it is because I have stood on the shoulder of giants, says Isaac Newton. And that's true. No, we cannot arrive at new knowledge apart from previous knowledge. Let's look at the convocation address. The sage instructs, practice virtue, do not refrain from study and teaching. Practice truth, do not refrain from study and teaching. Practice austerity, tapas, do not refrain from study and teaching. Practice self-control, do not refrain from study and teaching. Practice tranquility. Do not refrain from study and teaching. The reverberating message in these verses is Svadhyaya, pravakane ka. And it means do not refrain from study and teaching. The word Svadhyaya actually means self-study or lifelong learning. A faint echo of this idea occurs later in the teachings of Socrates when he says an unexamined life is not a human life. An unexamined life is not worth living. The deepening of knowledge occurs when we can look at ourselves critically, when we can introspect and correct our own behavior. And here we see why studying and eventually teaching is a never-ending process in the Upanishads. Let's read further. Matyar Devo Bhava, Peter Devo Bhava, Akarya Devo Bhava, Atiti Devo Brava. Let your mother be a god to you. Let your father be a god to you. Let your teacher be a god to you. And let your guest be a god to you. This is an instruction about human relations. The essence being to treat people and anyone for that matter with respect. Later, we will see that this is the essential step in karma yoga, the yoga of work. We cannot let others disturb the peace of our mind, and certain attitudes help in this regard. And therefore, something that we can see now is that, yes, study very carefully, but also respect the people that come along the way. Let's look at the Chandogya Upanishad. The name of the Upanishad comes from Chanda, which refers to the poetic meter in which it is written. Poetically expressed, the message of this Upanishad is the importance of speech and song in life. Speech yields milk. It teaches, and so it does since it determines the course of our life and is the basis of our nourishment. There is an internal song in our breathing, and we must be aware of this. Otherwise, it says humorously, our head will fall off if we do things heedlessly. The internal chant that is being referred to here is still Om. Tagore explains, does one write poetry to explain something? It is a feeling within the heart that tries to find outside shape in a poem. That words have meaning is just the difficulty. That is why poets have to turn and twist them in meter and rhyme, so that meaning may be held somewhat in check and feeling allowed to express itself. Of course, Rabindranath Tagore is a poet unto himself, and that's also something we need to pay attention to. So Tagore continues, no? The main object of teaching is not to give explanations, but to knock at the doors of the mind. I can recollect many things which I did not understand, but which stirred me deeply. I was pacing the terrace of our house late in the afternoon. I could see at once that the evening has entered me. Its shades had obliterated myself. Now that the self was in the background, I could see the world in its true aspect, full of beauty and joy. And we see many stories very similar to these. For example, a young boy desiring knowledge went to a sage to be taught. The sage gives him 400 lean cows to be taken to the forest and instructs him to bring them back when they are 1,000. After several years, one of the cows speaks to him. We are 1,000 now, so take us back to your teacher. I will now teach you about Brahman. The boy was startled and said, yes, please teach me. The east is Brahman, and so is the west. The north is Brahman, and so is the south. Fire will now continue the teaching. Fire said, the earth is Brahman, so are the sky and ocean. Now the birds will teach you. The birds then spoke, the sun and moon are part of Brahman, as well as lightning. The life force in all living things is Brahman, so are hearing, sight, and mind. When the boy returned to the sage with the 1,000 cows, the sage said, your face shines like a knower of Brahman. Who has taught you? Being other than men. But I wish that you now teach me, said the boy. Then the sage taught him, and nothing was left out. Yes, nothing was left out. The great idea of which we here see the germ is that all these voices are inside ourselves. As we understand these truths better, we find the voice is in our own heart. The second idea we get is that of making the knowledge of Brahman practical. The truth was shown through everything with which the students were familiar. The earth became transformed, life became transformed. The sun, moon, stars, etc. became deified. The principle underlying these stories is that invented symbolism may be good and helpful, but already better symbols exist. That's, of course, from Vivekananda, who also further explains. And if you remember, he's Vivekananda. This world spoke to the early thinkers. Birds spoke to them. Animals spoke to them. The sun, the moon spoke to them. And little by little, they realized things and got into the heart of nature, not by cogitation, nor by the force of logic, not by picking the brains of others and making a big book, not even as I do, by taking up their writings and making a long lecture, but by patient investigation and discovery, they found the truth. Vivekananda continues, its essential method was practice, and so it must be always. It is practice first, knowledge afterwards. This is the essence of knowledge. But what is that? By knowing which everything else becomes known. The sage replies, just as by knowing a clod of clay, all the clay in the universe becomes known. So is this teaching. Of this mighty tree, if someone should strike at the root, it would bleed, but still live. If someone were to strike it in the middle, it would bleed, but still live. Being pervaded by the Atman, it stands firm, drinking in its moisture and rejoicing. Bring to me the fruit of the Nyogodha tree. The student brings it and says, breaks it open, says the sage. It is broken, sir. What do you see? Extremely fine seeds, sir. Break open one of those seeds. What do you see? Nothing, sir. My dear, says the sage. Out of this nothing has come this great Nyagodha tree. Out of this nothing comes the great tree. It is in that context that we remember or look at fractals. From the little or from the nothing emerges something. Fractals. What you ask is the beginning of it all. And it is this. Existence multiplied itself for the sheer delight of being and plunged into trillions of forms so that it might find itself innumerably. And that's from Sri Aurobindo. It is interesting how Father Roque Ferriols would actually have read Sri Aurobindo, considering that he wrote a dissertation on him in Fordham University. Nevertheless, it is these ideas that are worthy of our consideration. Let's look at the story of Narada. Narada says to the sage Sanak Kumara, I have studied all branches of learning, art, science, music, philosophy, as well as sacred scriptures, but I have gained no peace. I have heard from great teachers that only he who knows himself finds peace. The sage replies, what you have studied is name only. Meditate on name as Brahman. Observe that the sage does not say what he has studied is useless. He transforms it, deifies it by asking him to meditate on that. And I think that is very important, to meditate on that. The higher levels would say, is there anything higher than name? Speech is higher than name. Is there anything higher than speech? Mind is higher than speech. Is there anything higher than the mind? Prana is all this. Prana is all this. Moving on. Let's look at the Bradaranyaka Upanishads. So this is the longest of the Upanishads. And the name literally means vast forest teaching, no? The vast forest. It is famous for a long discourse between the sage Yajnavalkya and his wife Maitreyi. Some traces of social customs can be discerned from the Upanishads. For instance, female students were allowed to study along with male students. The central message is again about the underlying reality of Brahman and the neti-neti approach to indicate these. You are already aware about the neti-neti approach as we have discussed it in the earlier discussions on the Upanishads. So there's nothing to talk about it anything further. But let's look at the opening verses of these slides. The world existed first as a seed, which as it grew and developed, took on names and forms. As fire is hidden in wood, the self dwells in all forms and beings, even to the tips of the fingers. Yet, the ignorant do not know that. For behind the names and forms, the self is hidden. When one breathes, one knows him as breath. When one speaks, one knows him as speech. When one sees, one knows him as the eye. When one sees, one knows him as the ear. When one thinks, one knows him as the mind. All these are but names related to the acts of the self. And he who worships the self as one or another of them does not know the self. For of them, it is neither one or another. The self is the goal of all beings. For by knowing the self, one knows all. This self, which is nearer to us than anything else, is indeed dearer than a son or a daughter, dearer than wealth, dearer than all besides. This is where we see the philosopher king also. So far, the previous verses were an echo of the earlier Upanishads, and there's no need to explain these as we have already been explaining it for the past videos and recordings. But now the Upanishad introduces the ideal of the philosopher king. The boastful sage, Gargya, meets King Ajatasattu and says to him that he will teach about Brahman. The king humbly submits to be his student. Gargya begins. He who is the being in the sun, and at the same time the being in the eye, him I meditate upon as Brahman. He who is in the moon, and at the same time in the mind, him I meditate upon as Brahman. He who is in the lightning, and at the same time in the heart, him I meditate upon as Brahman. The king replies, please do not speak thus of Brahman. That being I worship as the transcendental, luminous, supreme, infinite power. Gargya continues, he who is the being in the sky and at the same time in the heart, him I meditate upon as Brahman. He who is in the wind and at the same time in the breath, him I meditate upon as Brahman. He who is in the fire and at the same time in the heart, him I meditate upon as Brahman. The king replies again, please do not speak thus of Brahman. That being I worship as all-pervading, changeless, effulgent, invisible, forgiveness, harmony, life force, and supreme will. What is the significance of that dialogue, and what is its importance? In this dialogue, we see the contrast between concrete symbols and abstract concepts that have no physical symbols. The king, by his reverential attitude to higher knowledge, has gone beyond the preliminary stage of meditation on Brahman through symbols around him. He has entered the realm of the abstract, whereas the sage was trapped in the realm of symbols. The sage realizes that his student has gone deeper, and so he asks the king, "Sir, please accept me as a disciple and teach me Brahman." Then the king took the sage by the hand, and the two walked side by side until they came upon a sleeping man. The sleep state. We've been talking about it since a while ago, and it's worth continuing talking about that. The king tried to wake the sleeping man, but the man did not stir. He rubbed the hands of the sleeping man, and slowly the man awoke. The king asked Gargya, this man, who is a conscious, intelligent being, where was he when he was thus asleep? And how did he thus wake up? Gargya was silent. The king continued. When this man, who is a conscious, intelligent being, is thus in deep sleep, he enters into the self within the lotus of heart, having withdrawn into himself both his senses and his mind. When the person withdraws his senses, he is said to be asleep. When the breath is restrained, speech is restrained, eye restrained, ear and mind are restrained. He enters into dream state. Just as the king moves about his own country as he pleases, so also in the dream state, one moves about one's own body as one pleases. Beyond the dream state is the state of deep sleep. In this state, he knows nothing. He enters into the 72,000 nerves, which go from the lotus of the heart. As the spider moves along its web, as small sparks come forth from the fire, even so the self moves forth through prana, through all worlds, through all beings. This is the essence of the Upanishad. Prana is the truth, and the self is the truth of that. That is the truth of the truth. Satyasha Satyam. In many of the Upanishads, the sun and the heart are similar. Just as the many rays of light radiate from the sun and energize the world, so also many rays of arteries, veins, and nerves radiate from the heart and energize the part of the body. The network of the nerves is compared to the spider's web. The spiders can only travel along the threads of the web. Similarly, the self moves along the nerves as prana. Prana, and more generally its manifestation, this world, is true, the verse says. But beyond that, the truth of truth, or the meaning of meaning, is Brahman. The subtle teaching comes from the lips of a king, indicating that the kings were deeply interested in philosophy. Their interest was not academic, but something very practical. How to make the abstract philosophy practical and lay the foundation for civilization becomes the dominant theme in the Bhagavad Gita when the Krishna appears as the ideal philosopher king. The phrase Satyasha Satyam indicates that there is a deeper dimension to the world that we see. These deeper layers are first physical, then neurological, and then philosophical. The senses are withdrawn from the outer world, and awareness seems to reside in the pranamaya kosha, the nervous network of the human being. If we think of the mind as the cognizer, a part of its activity is to give cohesion to all our sensory impressions and interpret it so that we may understand. The verses of this Upanishad suggest that a similar process is taking place with respect to our neural impressions that are interpreted in the form of a dream. Something to pay attention to. By the way, I started talking without referring you to which past pages of the Upanishads I'm in. Nevertheless, I hope I'm still making sense. I think I